with everybody. If it's not, then, well, I'm not really sure. Just let me know. We're on the fall 2021 workshop on prefixes, CURIEs, and IRIs. I hope everybody has found their way to the documents that are linked on this page. If not, take a second to type that first one in, and it's going to bring you to a Google Doc that is the nexus for all of the information of what we're going to talk about today, including this presentation in case you want to download it and refer to it later. Sorry, it's the second link that, actually, I don't know which one of those links goes to the Google Doc. I think it's the first one. Yeah, so.
Can you put that into the chat?
That's an excellent idea, yeah. All right, so it's in the chat. That's going to go to the Google Doc, and the Google Doc will link you to the slides. Then why don't we get going? So yeah, here we are. The idea of this workshop is we're going to talk about some of our current use cases and pain points related to prefixes, prefix maps, CURIEs, IRIs, and all the related parts of the semantic web that have spilled over into the biomedical domain. I hope that this is sort of a productive conversation because I think there's been a lot of efforts that have rolled in the last couple of years, and some of them have slowed down a little bit, some have lost steam, and some are still going. And we'll talk about all of our experiences and hopefully solve a couple of our mutual problems. Towards the end, we're going to talk about the Bioregistry, which is a large solution to several of the things I think we might be talking about. And then at the end, we'll talk about some things in some smaller breakout sessions, which there's already some information on the Google Doc about what we might talk about. But I think by the end, we'll have a better idea of which ones would be the best use of our small and limited time. So the overview of what we're going to do today is kind of what I just said. I'm going to give a little bit of a background for everybody. I'm going to put down some terminology I'd like to ask everyone tries to use today, since one of the big issues our community has had is actually that we don't know what each other are talking about at all times because we're using the same words to mean different things. I'll talk about some of the major issues I know everyone's having. Then I'll open up the floor to let everybody share some of their own scenarios and use cases and that kind of stuff. We'll take a quick break after that, and then we'll talk about the Bioregistry, like I mentioned. And then after that, we'll do a little bit of breakout discussions. And by the end, we'll hopefully have learned something, and maybe we can decide on some actionable parts, and we'll see what everybody thinks. So without further ado, let me talk about the vocabulary we're going to use today. Yeah, everyone's got this for reference material in case you want to look back to it. So the first thing is I want to talk about vocabularies about vocabulary. And so this isn't necessarily like specifically correct, but I think this is a good basis for the things we're going to talk about today. Like one of the big ideas for prefixes and IRIs and CURIEs is to talk about like sets of entities. And most of the time we're going to call those a semantic space. And a lot of sets of entities have names associated with them. And then you can build a namespace from that. And I think most useful for us and what we're most likely going to be talking about all day is identifier spaces, which is when you have a set of entities that each has a local unique identifier within its semantic space. And there's a couple other things a lot of us are interested in too, like dictionaries, thesauri, hierarchies, and ontologies. But those aren't the important parts we're going to be talking about today. There's a couple kinds of identifiers that exist, and I want to ask that everybody tries to refrain from using the word identifier specifically. Let's try and qualify it a little bit. So one time we're talking about local unique identifiers is when you're within like a semantic space, like the chemical entities of biological interest. And I use this example all the time. You can see a chemical, Ulster pollen on the right. And within the Kibi identifier space, it has a local unique identifier, which is 138,488. This is not a globally unique identifier. That kind of is obvious by the name, but I think it's worth saying. Then there's also things like URIs and IRIs and URLs, which I'll come back to those in a second, which can also describe Ulster pollen. And you can see this value is actually globally unique. And then there's also another alternate representation of a URI, which is called a compact URI or a CURIE. And you can see like you just basically replace the first part with Kibi, which is the prefix. And if you want to ask, is this globally unique? The answer is kind of no, but also it's kind of yes, depending on what you consider the globe. So let's try and avoid using just the word identifier. Let's try and prefix everything, no pun intended, sorry, with like a qualifier. So when it comes to IRIs, URIs, and URLs, for a lot of the things we do, they're pretty interchangeable. I know that's not exactly correct, but for the most practical setting, we're going to mostly be talking about URIs. And I'd refer back to Julie McMurray's paper, The Identifiers in the 21st Century, for actually the base definition I want to work on with all of these. So we're interested in URIs that also have like this URL resolvability, since that's the most practical thing for a lot of our use cases. So let's talk about like the anatomy of a URI a little bit more in detail. So here's this Kibi URI again, and we can split a lot of URIs up into two parts. First is the URI prefix, which is actually the same for every local unique identifier within a given semantic space. And then the part that comes at the end is the local unique identifier. And when you concatenate them together, you get a URI for a specific entity, which is globally unique. Now, the twin of the URI is the compact URI, which has a couple of different bits. So first, we've taken this URI prefix and we've actually replaced it with a prefix. And this prefix has a little bit of meaning about what's the semantic space it comes from. And so we know that this URI from before goes with the Kibi entity. So we're going to use Kibi as the prefix. And rather than just string concatenating them together, there's actually going to be a delimiter, which is the colon character. And this is a W3C standard. So we don't have to like justify doing it this way. The delimiter is always the colon, and there's a restricted character set of what you should be using in prefixes. But in practice, we've had a little bit of issues with that. So maybe we'll come back to it later. So URI prefixes are really interesting because they're very important when it comes to building prefix maps and doing a lot of semantic web things. So on the left, I give this example of a well-behaved URI from Kibi. It's the one we just talked about. It's possible to string split up the URI into like a left part, which is the URI prefix, and the right part, which is the local unique identifier. But I also want to give an example of like an ill-behaved URI, which can't be separated in the left and the right. This comes from a resource called Rebase. And that's another resource talking about enzymes and their functionality. And so you can see that the local unique identifier actually is inside the middle of the URI. And unfortunately has this pesky .html extension at the end. Now, some websites let you throw away the .html extension, but this one actually doesn't. If you get rid of that, it doesn't resolve. So this is a little bit of a problem. It means we can't really build up some of the things that we build up with URI prefixes using this URI. So instead of talking about URI prefixes, we want to kind of have a more general notion of what's a URI format string. This is what Wikidata uses. I think we can take a lot of inspiration for them. And what they do is they put a token, which is the $ followed by a 1, somewhere inside the string. And you should format, like a string format, that's where the name comes from, the local unique identifier into the place where that special token is. And that's a little more general, and it allows us to solve the way of constructing an URI from the local unique identifier for either of these resources. Now, if you've got a URI prefix, you can sort of trivially make a URI format string by putting this replacement token right at the end. Okay, and I mentioned very briefly that one of the reasons we care about this is to build up prefix maps. This is another thing that's going to show up in the vocabulary of what people are talking about today quite a bit. And prefix maps are a way of matching up a prefix to the URI prefix. Like I mentioned with this Kibi example, there's Kibi as the prefix, and then there's this kind of long URI bit that comes before the local unique identifier. And for a lot of applications, we actually want to have lists of which prefixes go with which URI prefix. A lot of people actually want to even impose this bijective mapping, which means there shouldn't be any duplicate keys or duplicate values. And yeah, this is useful for converting between compact URIs and URIs. It powers resolvers like identifiers.org. And you're seeing it all sorts of places in the semantic web showing up, like in RDF, in Sparkle, and in OWL. So we're going to mention this a couple of times. So I want to explain the concept of the banana, which is very silly sounding. And like many of the things that we're doing here, we're going to use silly words to describe it. So one of the ideas in identifiers.org is the namespace embedded in local unique identifiers. And there's a couple entries where this shows up, where sometimes you'll write the local unique identifier with a redundant prefix attached to it. So even though it's a local unique identifier, sometimes people will write it actually as a query. And identifiers.org has a field to just remind people sometimes this happens. And this is a little bit of a problem we'll come back to later, because I think it's causing some pain for me and for others. But unfortunately, the knowledge that like this might show up as a redundant thing in the beginning, it's not quite enough. So the banana is kind of one extra bit that says, not only is there a redundant prefix, but the banana explains what does it look like. So why would you need to like curate this? And why would you need to know about this? Well, you need to be able to support people who are using legacy definitions of like a local unique identifier that looks like a curie. And sometimes it's not actually the same thing as the prefix itself. So like one example is Swiss lipids. Their prefix is Swiss lipid, and their redundant namespace that's embedded in their identifiers is SLM. So it's worth knowing the thing that's there. And we'll come back to this, I think, later in discussion. So it also helps you canonicalize a curie or yeah, throw away those bits. Like down here, you see this like go and then go. Sometimes it happens that you get two in a row. So what's a registry? So I think the most famous one's definitely the identifiers.org registry, which was originally called the Miriam registry. And this is like a tool, a database that associates prefixes with all sorts of different kinds of metadata. So usually this is like the name of the resource or the semantic space, a description, a homepage. Sometimes some information about what the preferred prefix might be in case you have some stylization that occurs. Like for example, within the Obo Foundry, there's stylization applied to several different different resources in kind of different ways. Like a lot of them usually just stylize their prefixes with uppercase, but a couple of them use mixed case, like flybase. And then you might also want to have like an example, a local unique identifier, just to help people kind of understand what's inside it, and even a regular expression that helps you validate local unique identifiers. And finally, you want to have these URI prefix or a set of URI prefixes that can allow you to construct URIs out of local unique identifiers for the semantic space attached to a given prefix. And so, yeah, a couple examples of registries are like the Obo Foundry, which is a library of resources, but it also is acting as a registry in some ways. Resolvers like identifiers.org and name to thing also have registries associated with them. In some ways, you can also consider lookup services like OntoB and the ontology lookup service as having their own internal registries that matches up information about resources to prefixes. Databases like Uniprot, the Gene Ontology Association database, they actually maintain their own registries as well, so they know what kind of resources they're referencing in CURIEs. And other resources like Wikidata also are acting as registries in some ways. So the last things might be new for everybody is the idea of a meta registry. And a meta registry is a special kind of registry whose entries and the prefixes actually corresponds to other registries. And a meta registry has a couple extra special properties because first it's meta, so it can contain an entry about itself. A meta registry also contains mappings between the prefixes in its constituent registries. So if you have the, let's go back to the last slide, some entry in Obo Foundry, like for the Kibi ontology, and you also have an identifiers.org, a reference to Kibi, you should have a mapping between those that actually doesn't exist. So you'd want a meta registry to have information like that. And the meta registry also keeps track of the kind of capabilities that each registry has. In the last slide, I presented a couple of different kinds of places where you might have a registry, and each of them has a different kind, a couple of different kinds of capabilities. And so, yeah, there really weren't any meta registries before. We're going to talk about the Bioregistry later and how it sort of solves this problem and can enable certain things. And then the last two things, which I've seen people throwing these terms around a lot, so I wanted to just make sure, is the idea of a resolver and a lookup service. And so we talked about the identifiers.org resolver, whose job is to take a query and sort of turn it into a URI for you. So you don't have to really know what all of those URI prefixes are ahead of time. There's the Perl system, which is a very important semantic web resource. And then the Obo library's Perl system, which is a little more domain specific, is also the name to thing resolver. Sometimes people call them meta resolvers as well. I don't think there's a really big difference, but if somebody knows why you would call one but not the other, please let me know. And then the idea of a lookup service is something that can take in a query and also return some content about that rather than just redirecting you to a new web page. And so like OntoB, the ontology lookup service, ABRAL, and the bio lookup service are all examples of lookup services. Okay, so thanks for bearing with me for a couple minutes while I gave you this huge dump of like information. So I just want to talk about a couple major issues that I know I'm having, and I think everybody else is that we've seen, especially in this Google Doc as we've written up our issues. So first, there's a lot of URIs for the same entities. So like I mentioned in the beginning, this is the Ulster pollen example again. Kiwi has its own first-party URI that goes with the entity. Identifiers.org has actually 4 different variants for every query, which is a little bit of a problem. There's the HTTP and the HTTPS version of everything. And they also have like this query syntax where there's a colon in the middle, but also they sometimes use the / syntax, which is, I think, a legacy implementation, but they still exist in places, so we have to be careful about them. So there's also obopearls, which kind of solve the same thing. Let's build another globally unique standard. Name to thing is normally used as a resolver, but sometimes people will use those URIs as identifiers. Bioportal also mints URIs, OOS, though those aren't really the goals of them, and then so on and so on. Any other resource can have like lots of different URIs pointing to the same entity. Another problem, there's a lot of different synonyms for the same prefixes. And I'm going to point out SNOMED right now, which has like a ton of different prefixes that people refer to it with. I didn't count how many this is, but it's definitely more than 10. So like SNOMED has no W in it. Sometimes people do spell it with a W. So that's a problem. So that's like a typo. But then sometimes people also like include the CT, which stands for clinical terms. Sometimes they don't include it. Like depending on who you are and where you are and who you're working with, one of these might make more sense than the other. But this presents a big problem for everybody who wants to resolve queries and like figure out what's going on. There's also a lot of registries. Like I gave a couple examples in the last slide, but there's a lot of people keeping track of different kinds of metadata for the same resources. And so like there's not that much coordination going on. There's historically a little bit of efforts between Prefix Commons, identifiers.org, and name to thing, but that's stalled a little bit as far as I can tell. Like I mentioned before, there's no mappings between the prefixes in any of these registries, and each one of them kind of keeps a different set of metadata based on what its goals are. And so, yeah, one of the big questions, like, how can we make use of all these different resources that have curated information about all these prefixes? And like, how do we even assess who has what and like which ones are the same? These are not easy questions, but I think we've been working towards these things, and we'll present a little bit of that with the Bioregistry again. And then here's like the last kind of difficult thing, because I've given a lot of thought about like how to approach these issues, and when people are relying on incumbent services that are kind of dropping the ball, like how do we discuss that as a community? And so let's like try and be as thoughtful as possible in the discussion. But we're having a couple issues with using identifiers.org and similarly name to thing. One of the big problems with identifiers.org is that the underlying data isn't public. So it's really hard to allow people to get involved in the maintenance process, and it's only maintained by a very small group of people who aren't really publicly responsible for it. And so as maintenance kind of stalls, we're sort of getting unreliable help when talking to them on GitHub. There aren't really any other accessible ways to get in touch and make improvements to a service like identifiers.org. So like this model isn't really working. Having closed data doesn't allow us to have sort of a sustainable resource. Sort of on the other side is like the code that also powers identifiers.org isn't public. And so when there's bugs, it also is possible. It's not very easy for people to look at it and say, hey, this is why this is happening, and maybe even propose a solution. Yeah. So all of these things kind of contribute to the idea that longevity is low, especially if things like maintenance are predicated on organizational funding. And so if everything's based on that, then when funding dries up, then service ends, and people who are relying on it are going to have a big problem. And so we have to think of ways to make services that have this longevity, that aren't based on funding, they're not based on a small closed group of people maintaining it, and they're not based on anything that's proprietary or closed or internal to an organization. It has to be open. And then the last one's, yeah, when data becomes inaccurate, we also we can't do anything about it if it's in this situation where it's a closed small group that doesn't really have the time or the motivation to make updates. If we have a way of making this a community effort, the fact that data is inaccurate, this isn't a big problem. Someone could just fix it. So these are some of the problems that I find are really big, but I think it's time to kind of open it up and ask everybody, like, what are your general questions about prefixes, CURIEs, IRIs, or the things that you want to hear about today? We have maybe 10 minutes for this. And then we can move on and talk a little bit more about specific use cases. I think a couple of people prepared some slides. There's some notes that we made in the Google Doc, and I'm going to stop talking now and open this up. I can help moderate, but everybody should be able to speak. I think you should be able to unmute yourself. There aren't any Zoom restrictions right now. And yeah, so let me open up the floor. Does anyone have anything they wanted to ask about? And by the way, if you are asking something, it'd be great if you could also write down what you were talking about in the Google Doc. Yeah, Tom, please.
So just to get things started off, one pain point that I've run into over time is a question of case sensitivity of prefixes, because the Curie spec says that they're case sensitive, but there's a number of legacy systems and there's a number of users and use cases where it is troublesome to educate about case sensitivity.
Yeah, does anyone from the OBO community want to maybe talk about the preferred prefix concept in OBO and how that's a little bit different from the way that identifiers.org picks their prefixes?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a slide on this later if there's time to do it, but yeah, no, I agree with Tom that the Curie standard does say, and the URI standard does say it's case sensitive. So I think in order to just do basic joins between data, we need to agree on the preferred way to write a Curie. And this isn't just an OBO thing. It's not like just OBO decided to go, hey, we're going to kind of go uppercase. There was, before identifiers.org existed, we had a Go prefix registry where we standardized not just for ontologies, but for multiple different contributing databases, what the preferred way to write the prefix was. And maybe somewhat annoyingly, some were kind of mixed case, like flybase, and some were all uppercase. But when identifiers.org started, it kind of slurped all these in and just made everything lowercase. So we kind of lost the preferred prefixes. And then what happened was there was a kind of fork where some people started using the lowercase prefix, lowercase go colon 1, 2, 3, 4. Others carried on using the correct uppercase version. And it seems trivial, but it's one more thing that you have to kind of normalize and correct before you can kind of merge data together. I mean, if someone's making OBO files or database tables with kind of lowercase go, they're not going to automatically merge with the ones with uppercase. So I think this is definitely one of many of one requirement for many of us here is that we have a way to agree on a kind of preferred casing for these. And these shouldn't be kind of imposed from above. The actual providers themselves have a preferred way of kind of writing these that should be recorded.
I'd like to just mention about case sensitivity. Generally it seems fine to have some kind of case preserving, feature where there is a preferred way and you can preserve the case as you transcribe these things and display them. But I do think there's a world of pain out there if we make things case sensitive on lookup. In other words, you have two distinct prefixes that are distinct, but are the same except for uppercasing something. So that distinction, case preserving, is made rather than, but I would recommend case insensitive on lookup. Yeah,
we should definitely stop people trying to register a duplicate prefix that differs in case. That would be terrible.
I have a small point of interest. It just occurred to me that our Zoom account, our institutional Zoom account, doesn't have past a 40-minute time.
No, Charlie, I think you didn't use the Harvard Zoom account. I think you set this up somehow with your personal account. So let me maybe make one with the Harvard account and post the link. And I think we might have to migrate over
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Sorry about that, everyone. A little bit of oversight.
I have a Zoom room we can use if that's of interest. Do you want me to put the link in the agenda?
Whichever one of you
I
can
have a,
prepare it.
well, I also just started one, so
Why don't we wrap
Okay,
that
that's
up?
fine.
And then-
Never mind.
Yeah, so again, sorry about that, everyone. So let's see, is there anything else in the chat that people were interested about that I was talking about?
I mean, this is Ian. I wanted to comment, rather than getting sucked into the weeds. So I'm at NIH. I worked with Tim and Julie and lots of others I can see here as part of this. As part of, we funded through the BD2K program, and it's done through Force 11, a data citation group, and work with identifiers.org and N2T. And, from an NIH point of view, we really looking for this to get to the point where it's an infrastructure that can be widely deployed and used by day-to-day researchers. And so the issues, for example, about whether identifiers.org is responsive and whether it's a production system or whether the exchange with N2T kind of works is, we probably got some gaps to get to that point, but that's the real goal, is that this kind of infrastructure needs to be at a level where it can just be relied upon as part of the background. It doesn't help, I think, if amongst the group, the problem is that it's that the help desk of identifiers.org is not responsive. I think we need to be looking at how we help one another to establish a system that works collaboratively with different players involved, and getting this to something that's reliable is really important.
I see the solution in this kind of open data, open code, distributed responsibility, distributed contributions kind of approach, because it's perhaps this old model that is somehow broken, that is the issue, and not that we need to secure another few years of funding, but that this model is just not doesn't secure longevity to some extent, right?
Melissa has her hand raised.
Thanks, Charlie.
Wait one second. After she's done talking, we're going to switch over to the other Zoom room. Okay.
Okay. I won't take too long. So I just wanted to comment on Ian's comment, because I completely agree. We've been here before. We've tried this before. Why did it really not fail? We had some pretty good infrastructure. We had some pretty good community documentation, investment, different groups working together. And I think fundamentally what we lacked was the transparency that we talked about at the beginning. Not all groups had equal sort of open mechanisms for community input or for community contributions. But also what we really lacked was governance. How do we actually make the decisions around, this is how X, Y, or Z should be resolved? How do we make sure that we're checking on things being resolved? And ultimately, I think in the face of having kind of robust governance around those things, we ended up with all of the original contributors and partners in those conversations not actually doing the things that we all kind of agreed to or wanted to see happen. And then it kind of just fizzled out. And part of that was funding and just, initiatives that had kind of helped bring those things to fruition, kind of fizzling out or ending. But I think fundamentally, when we think about the architecture and the partnerships across the groups, we need to simultaneously start documenting how do we make decisions, how do we know that those decisions are followed through on, and how do we sort of move the whole collective forward as a group.
Thanks, Melissa. That's actually a really interesting discussion that we're having across several related communities at the same time for all sorts of varieties of reasons. we're definitely going to come back to that. I think we have an idea that goes with this idea of open source and open code attached to the bioregistry, which you've also helped us make and improve. So thanks. Okay, so now I think it's